I'm with you.
Well, um,
Yeah.
I think we should just dive into this.
Let's
I
do it.
was I was imagining a title as something like the spiritual mission of America. Um,
The spiritual mission of America. Let me write that down. That's cool.
it's
I'm
actually a
assuming mission has like a double sense in that. Is
mm,
that true?
mission as like the purpose, the aim, what we as a people should be
Mm.
striving for, but also I guess it could have a religious connotation.
Hmm.
Um, what other senses were you hearing in the term?
Oh, I just was curious if you meant it in like the missionary sense, like a sort of evangelical sense, or
Well, yeah, all of the senses. But not necessarily
hmm.
um exclusivist in like in terms of what religious tradition that might be, creating the
Sure, sure.
mission. And but that would be one of the things we would discuss is the value of pluralism perhaps in this American project.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Yeah, that's a step
so
further than just like the American dream or the American vision, the mission,
the mission.
spiritual mission. Interesting.
Yeah, dream and vision. I mean, dream is like um I don't know, it's a little too sleepy. It's not active
Yeah.
enough.
I have I would love
And
to, I have some thoughts about that. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I feel like mission is more, and vision is a little too passive also. Like we're just looking, waiting for it to happen. Whereas mission is like, if this is going to happen, we have to
Mm.
do it.
Hmm.
You know, we have a role
Yeah.
to play. Um, but before we get into that, I think, I mean, there's so much context to you and I coming together to have this
Yeah.
conversation.
Yeah.
Um, and I just want to thank you, first of all, for agreeing to talk to
Oh,
me
yeah.
because it's really important. This originated in a disagreement on Facebook about whether or not it was reasonable to say that reasonable people would vote for, Kamala Harris instead of Donald
Hmm.
Trump.
Hmm.
And you helped remind me that maybe that was a little bit too slanted. And you did so in a way that was, I think, inviting a further conversation.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I really appreciated that. And I think it's
Yeah,
important
thanks.
that we try to model that as a way of continuing to do politics across divides in this country that are widening so much that they might actually be tearing the social
Yeah,
fabric apart.
absolutely.
Um, so yeah, thank you. Um, and yeah, we both live in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and it's obviously one of the hubs of progressive political thought in this country. And
Hmm.
you know, Gavin Newsom was um, the mayor of San Francisco, and Kamala Harris worked in his
Yeah.
administration, and
Yeah.
was born and raised, here in the East Bay and Oakland, and went to school in Berkeley, and so like we're right in the midst of that culturally, and I think um,
Hmm.
a good place for us to start getting into maybe some of the more big ideas about what the mission of this country is and what the position of the United States is moving forward in a new Trump administration. I think it would be good to start with some personal background and kind of, I'd love to hear your political autobiography,
Sure. Yeah.
how you came to be, um, to have the perspective that you have now. And, you can go into as much detail as you want, as you're comfortable sharing, because I think it would be really interesting. And then
Hmm. Hmm.
um, maybe I'll say a little bit about my own journey, and we can see where the overlaps are, and then go from there into
Yeah.
thinking about the collective.
Yeah, it's a vast road in front of us. But yeah, I think starting with a little autobiographical context makes sense. Yeah, so I mean, I could just share briefly. My parents are academics. I grew up kind of mostly on the West Coast, but I landed in Omaha, Nebraska as a kid, and I sort of most of my childhood and adolescence was in the Midwest, and I had this kind of dual enculturation because my parents were California academics, but I was, like I was in Omaha, Nebraska, and a lot of my peers were um, very like intense evangelical Christians. I would say like Dominionist Christians, which is like, kind of a variant of evangelical Protestantism where you like basically have the goal to take over the government and establish a theocracy. It's like very
Yeah.
intense kind of Ted Cruz stuff. And that was like the milieu I was in many ways. And so I was, and my parents are politically basically anarchists.
And they were in
I think that
Omaha because they were teaching at the university there. They got
Yeah,
jobs there. That okay.
exactly.
Yeah.
My mom is a theater or was a theater professor, got a job, a tenure track job there, and we just kind of ended up there. They're humanities
Mhm.
academics, and job markets is what it is, and so they ended up in the Midwest, and they really liked it in some ways. And so, anyways, I kind of had this like dual sensibility always. I felt like I could, my I feel like it's also relevant. My dad's side is like generationally democratic, like organizers, activists. My grandpa was one of the leaders of um a strike against Reagan in California. He worked for the water district and like led one of the only successful strikes against Reagan in history, and was like personally hated by Reagan, like lifelong kind of Kennedy style Catholic Democrats, working class Democrats. So yeah, all of their values were like thoroughly progressive. They were kind of, I call them like reformed hippies in a lot of ways because they were, really into like Joseph Campbell and sort of human potential California style social causes, but like kind of had buttoned up jobs. Um, but yeah, so my parents were my whole family was very progressive and kind of came of age during, the Bush years and came into like political consciousness that time. And I remember my dad like losing his mind when the announcement of the war in Iraq happened, and just sort of really feeling like, yeah, our team is against the government. Like we do not like Republicans, this whole neocon sort of like um religiously motivated thing is evil, and and is basically what we're against. And yeah, so that's very much where I came from. I um went to a progressive liberal arts school in New England. I studied religion, which is kind of relevant later, religion and philosophy, and got really into Kingian on like the nonviolent sort of political activist thought, or like science, I'd say, of Dr. Martin Luther King. Did like Kingian nonviolence training, which is like basically as progressive as it gets. Um, have been interested in Buddhism, practicing Buddhist for over a decade, which is, at least in America, almost exclusively quite progressive, especially in California. I
Mhm.
voted Green twice. I like gave all the money I had and time I had to Jill Stein and Ajama Baraka's campaign. Voted Green twice. Very much took after like my sort of guiding lights politically were like Cornel West, Chris Hedges, Amy Goodman, Howard Zinn, like you know, these kind of revolutionary progressive voices. So that's really where I came from, and I still feel like a lot of my values are. I don't like the term revolutionary, but I do think that like I am interested in like leading with a moral cause and sort of like shaping policy and things in light of like a transcendent moral cause, and I think there's at its best a lot of progressive thought does that. Um, but yeah, so I mean, and not to get too much in the weeds, but I sort of was thinking through some relevant moments of my journey, and I think a few stand out. One was a while ago and had to do with religion. Some of my friends from the Bay Area Um, well, one in particular had a close family friend who actually writes for The Guardian, does like op-ed pieces for The Guardian, um, and writes on current events, ecological issues, and also cultural issues. And he was I met him at one point, and we were having a nice conversation about traveling and stuff. And he was sharing that he had just written a recent piece on Islamophobia in the West, and I was really interested because I actually studied Buddhist and Islamic comparative theology. So I know if my advisor was a Rumi scholar, and I actually know a decent amount of like Islamic history and Islamic jurisprudence. And so I was talking to this guy about his views about like how conservatives in the West are terribly Islamophobic, and they have this caricature of this of Islam as um, I can't like basically homophobic or yeah, let's just say like homophobic in this case. And as I was talking to him, it became really clear that he just didn't have any basis, any knowledge of like Islamic jurisprudence or any kind of like he just didn't really know what he was talking about. And I talked to him more, and it was just really striking that like he had the best intentions, but he just had no like sense of the diversity of Islamic thought and like Islamic history and how these things are actually like pretty explicitly prohibited, like in many traditions. And like at the very minimum, you have to like engage with that as one of the voices in the Islamic um, umbrella. And he just like would not accept that as a valid, that was like a sort of it was impossible to him. And it was so clear to me that he was projecting these liberal values onto another and just was kind of ignorant to like what he was talking about. So that was like a kind of, I just bring that up as like one of the turning points where I kind of stumbled into like this weird sense of like chosen ignorance or sort of like the hidden illiberalism in liberalism. Um, and that was just one of many, but it felt especially kind of um, emblematic. And then there was another I could share later because it has to do with more current events. But a lot of, I came to criticize the Democratic Party or sort of the liberal establishment um, from the left. Learned like studying and listening to a lot of Cornel West's criticism of Obama in particular, domestically and especially foreign policy. Just like all of the, I mean, I hands down, I think bu the Bush administration is like undoubtedly the worst administration in recent history, if not ever, in terms of like civil liberties and foreign wars and all kinds of stuff. But like all of the worst things that the Bush administration did, Obama pretty much rubber stamped and was like, "Yep, we're just gonna more or less continue down the road of doing that." Whether it's like torture, like like foreign interventions, all of these horrible things, and you're just like
Deportations.
deportations, all of these things, yeah, and and it was the cognitive dissonance for me. I mean, I thought Obama was just you know our prince. Like I remember I was living in France at the time when he got elected, and I just felt so proud of America. I'm so excited, and my dad and I were just like overjoyed with like optimism. And it took me years of listening to these progressive intellectuals pointing out these details about the just utter egregious moral failings of Obama domestically and foreignly in terms of foreign policy, like Chris Hedges and Cornel West to really just be like, wow, there's something there. Like he really did go like above and beyond to screw over people, um, in the wake of Occupy Wall Street and like the persecution of whistleblowers and these things that are like he went out of his way to like do kind of the opposite of what he got elected to do. So these were this was like probably a decade of reflection and just sort of discernment of like, okay, how much how much control does he have over these things, and realizing and watching, watching the next sort of iteration was watching Bernie. I gave all of my money that I didn't really have and all of my time to the both
Yeah.
Bernie campaigns. I was at the
Yeah.
opening of the last one in San Francisco. I was super excited, you know. And the way he just like utterly sold out both times with no concessions or anything, and the way that he was undercut just brutally by the establishment that, I mean, both times Obama was like clearly in the mix.
Mhm.
It was just heartbreaking and just kind of egregious. So um, yeah, it was not what I anticipated or wanted, but I definitely over the years came to see like, oh, there's a lot of justified resentment towards the establishment, the liberal order, the rules, so-called rules-based liberal order, and that's something to take seriously.
Yeah. Well, we have no choice now. I think
Yeah.
with this last election, that resentment is obviously, well, I think it's obviously what was driving people um, to vote against a continuation of Biden's administration with Kamala Harris becoming president.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, short of, not having parents who are as active as you, my parents are more or less apolitical. Um, Aside from that one major difference, I resonate with so much of what you've shared there. Um, and I think the level of involvement that your family had in progressive politics and like working class type politics, I think also speaks to a way in which over the last decades the Democratic Party has really changed,
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
and been less focused on class-based economic movements
Yeah.
and instead more on other um, cultural identity issues, which I wouldn't want to simply dismiss as not important, but
No.
they're easily um, when you only focus on culture and then you get into this situation where I think we're expecting government to do something it's not really designed to do, and also something it's not very good at doing, which is
Yeah.
trying to shift culture. Like politics should be downstream of culture. And um, anyways, we'll get more into that later, hopefully. But I think thinking back to the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, I think that was the time that um, while I was in high school, uh, with the Iraq War starting in 2003,
Yeah.
um, kind of in the aftermath of 9/11, like that was my period of political awakening, not just because of current events, but because I was getting into my,
Yeah.
second half of my teens and starting to think about these things. And um, it was, yeah, Chomsky and Zinn and
Chomsky. Yeah, definitely. Me too.
yeah,
Yeah.
that clued me into some of these critiques of American imperialism and the way the propaganda operates. And I can remember actually the first Bush administration, um, George H.W., when he went to Iraq in the early 90s, when the CIA's guy, Saddam Hussein, decided to either not follow orders or maybe follow orders, or I'm not sure what, I don't want to get too conspiratorial, but invades Kuwait. And then the US decides we have to get rid of this guy now, who had been we installed him for
Yeah.
decades, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so, learning about that later, I was like, what? Like in terms of US foreign policy, we are not the good guys. That's the story we're told. And nor
Wait,
are we just the
what?
bad, we're not the
Wait.
bad guys either. Like everybody's bad.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's the shitty truth of it. But
Yeah.
anyways, I remember being a kid Like, gosh, I think 91 was when the first Gulf War happened. So I was like 5 or 6, and I'm sitting in the living room with my dad, watching CNN,
Hmm.
and it's just so theatrical. And I remember even as a 5-year-old thinking like, wow, this is
Wow,
dramatic. Like,
as a 5-year-old, wow.
well, I was like worried that they were because they were talking about chemical weapons, and like a lot of the narrative was the same back then as it was in 2003 or in the run up to the second Gulf War
Wow.
about, Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. And so I was like, I asked my dad, like, what if there's a bomb that drops in the backyard and poisons us? Like, are we safe? Because the way the news was presenting this was like we could be attacked at any minute, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and so, seeing the way that over the last almost 20 years now, 15 years or so, that, George W. Bush, who I agree with you was the worst president in living memory for me, um, his image has been recuperated in some sense by not
Yeah.
just the Democratic establishment, or not just the Republicans the establishment, but the Democratic establishment as like, oh, this was a normal president and Trump is abnormal, you know, like as if George Bush somehow wasn't the president who lied as a pretext to get us into a war that killed possibly a million people and U.S. troops and Iraqis, and basically gave, not only was it immoral and murderous, but ended up empowering Iran, and there were no weapons of mass destruction. It cost $1 trillion, etc. And now all of a sudden, Michelle Obama has given him hugs and uh, fist fist bumping, and he's some kind of a hero because he represents a norm which had existed prior to Trump coming in and disrupting everything.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so that's all that's all suspicious, but um,
Yeah, just to kind of underline that. I mean, I think a lot of, we'll probably get into it, but a lot of my morals come from like Buddhist ethics, like, and the first of the basic ethical precepts is like, do not murder. You're not permitted in any circumstance to murder. And what is murder on a social scale? It's preemptive war.
yeah,
Like, what are the worst things you can do to another person? You can kill them and you can torture them. And on a mass scale, these people engendered that more than any other force in our, history, like, or at least like recent history. And these are the same people that you're gonna get on stage with and like be stoked that they're endorsing you, and like that kind of just utter just it's just utter disregard for like the yeah, I don't know, just the moral, like,
mm,
just debasing of your currency. It's like, how
mhm,
is that okay? These are the
yeah,
worst people, like, objectively.
mhm,
And and I raised that with Democratic friends, and they just, their eyes gloss over and they're like, well, he said grab her by the pussy. It's like, that's not great. I don't want him to babysit my kids or sister or whatever, but like, dude, that if that's not okay, like, murdering and torturing myriad people is, how is that not also a problem? And it's
yeah,
just it's just not register.
mhm.
So, anyways, I just say that to underline what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah, and I think uh, with the revelations of what was going on at the Abu Ghraib prison with the torture of Iraqi
Yeah.
inmates, that the CIA would just pick up random people off the streets of Iraq and try to get information from them,
Yeah.
by torturing them. And at that point, the progressive left and Democrats more broadly seem to have a very negative attitude towards the U.S. intelligence agencies,
Yeah.
um, who are doing these sorts of covert operations and torturing people.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, 10, 11 years later, this tremendous inversion occurred where all of a sudden uh, the progressive Democrats love the FBI. And well, I mean, after at least this 2016 election,
Hmm.
Hillary didn't like what Comey did by talking about her emails and stuff. But there was this sense in which the only way to resist Trump was by supporting the so-called deep state agencies
Yes.
against him.
Yes.
And I don't know how that it's such a striking about face. And it always confused me. And the way in which everybody complains about
It's
Trump denying
astonishing.
Trump denies the election in 2020, that he lost the election in 2020,
Hmm.
which is, I think, absurd. And he incited some violence,
Yeah.
I would say, that was not okay. But if you go back to 2016, like the whole Democratic establishment was denying the result of the election by claiming that basically the narrative was Putin hacked it, and
Yeah.
that's why Hillary lost. So
Yeah. The
there's no,
tagline was illegitimate, illegitimate president. Yeah.
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 So in their own way, there
For
was also,
years.
yeah, for years. No, I mean, Rachel Maddow made and MSNBC made so millions and millions of dollars on selling that narrative and had a huge audience for those 4 years. Now all of a
Hmm.
sudden her audience is gone, which is interesting.
Hmm.
The time,
Yeah.
there's been some kind of intense shift over the last 8 years
Yeah.
in this country that's has been hard for me to understand. There's a kind of
Hmm.
scrambling of the left-right spectrum. Um,
Yeah. Isn't that so interesting? Just how
and that,
meaningless those terms are in our
mhm.
context.
Yeah, major demographic shifts
Mhm.
in terms of who's voting for who, and uh, you know, in terms of Black and Latino voters and men and women.
Yeah.
Um, I want to actually go into those statistics in a minute, but because it's something that I think a lot of progressives in their autopsies, like what went wrong, why did Harris lose, are
Yeah.
totally ignoring because it's the same trope. Uh, oh, it's
Yeah.
because America's not ready for a black woman or a woman of
Yes.
color as
Hmm.
president, and um,
Yeah.
that I mean that may or may not be true, but if you look at the polling data, I think it suggests that
Yeah.
there wasn't major shifts in what white people were voting, who white people were voting for, major shifts in who Black
Yeah.
and Latino voters in favor of Trump. Not that he got the majority, actually. So let's just get into that. I think that would
Sure.
be
Yeah. That's a
important right
great.
now.
Yeah.
Um, and I'll share my screen because there's a neat little graphic that will just bring this home very quickly. Um, all right, you see that?
Oh, yeah. I was looking at that earlier. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Um, so if men by race, right? Trump does get 60% of white men.
Yes.
Um, he gets 25% of black men,
Hmm.
and 48% of Latino men,
Hmm.
which is basically a statistical tie with Harris. And
Yeah.
this is a huge shift. Trump has doubled his numbers with black and Latino voters in general, and
Hmm.
especially with black and Latino men. Um, but when you look at younger men, um, Trump gets even more younger,
A
black men
third.
under 44, a third. And basically, now he's 1 point ahead of Harris among
Yeah.
younger Latino men. And of course, among white men, 57% went for Trump. Um,
Hmm.
so that suggests, and if you look at what Biden got with black voters and Latino voters in 2020, um, you would think Harris would do better with black voters
Yeah. If your
than
logic was
Biden,
identity politics,
but
it'd be
she
a
did
safe bet.
worse. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so something's happening with younger men for sure.
Hmm.
I think there's a shift in terms of working class people of whatever race, recognizing that the Democratic Party is primarily focused on the interests of the professional managerial class and
Hmm.
highly educated professionals, and not on the blue collar workers, not on the um, lower middle class and working classes. And so somehow Trump is appealing to them. Um, it remains to be seen how much help he'll be able to give people like that.
Sure.
We'll
Yeah.
see. But
Time will tell.
but there does seem to be a perception that Democrats don't understand the struggles of everyday working people, and that the focus on these cultural issues, abortion might be the one where I think Democrats had the advantage, but Trump was
Hmm.
smart to say
Yeah.
to the evangelicals supporting him, like, whoa, 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 no national abortion ban. Do you want me to win the election or not?
Yeah.
Uh, and now that he's won, who knows what will happen, but it seems like he's wanting it to stay with the states. Okay. But there are other cultural issues, which again are not unimportant, but like, making issues that affect 3% of the population into a national political issue that everybody has to be for or against, like trans
Oh, yeah.
issues,
Yeah.
which, these are the lives of real people who are suffering. And I think it does matter, but
Of
it's
course. Yeah.
the genius of the Republican Party in making something that's really complicated, actually, into a national debate where most people never had to deal with a kid who's having this issue, you know, and for us to all have to make political decisions about which president we're going to vote for based on an issue like that, I think is a huge distraction from what really matters for 97% of the country every day.
Mhm.
And that becomes too much of a deciding factor, I think. Um, so all that's just to say, I think these cultural issues that Democrats have focused on are alienating people, including the people they think they're speaking for. Um,
Mhm.
Often, especially those people. Um, I remember in the 2020 primary when I was so hoping that Bernie and Warren, Elizabeth Warren, would get together, but she pulled this feminist card and said that Bernie was sexist. Um, but she also, during her campaign, took a lot of heat, and she was not getting any traction. Uh, but she took some heat for using this academic term Latinx to refer to Latino people. And again, like most Latinos don't even know, they've never heard that word. They don't know what it means. It's alienating for them.
Yeah.
Um, and she's a professor and comes right out of, that elitist way
Harvard.
of doing, yeah, progressivism that it's just clearly not, it's not working anymore. Um, and I recognize that even while I, I think there are real dangers to the types of nativism that come out of the
Mhm.
MAGA movement that can put some of uh, you know,
These groups at risk.
these groups at risk.
Hmm.
Um, and I do worry about that. And yet I think some of that gets overblown. And I think I'm not as worried about Trump being an actual fascist, because I think there is a lot of diversity in his among his voters. And I think this country also is so bureaucratic in the way that power is distributed
Hmm.
that it would be very difficult for him to actually become an autocrat.
Totally.
Um, so yeah,
There's a lot there. I have a few thoughts. Can I
please.
reflect some?
Mm,
So there are a few things. One is I'm not actually that familiar with the statistics, if there are any that reflect the Asian population.
mm,
I'd be curious to know, but my understanding is that the Native American population, not that it's a large voting bloc, but it is a significant, I mean, the POC, right? People of,
right.
like the I is like
In BIPOC,
yeah,
indigenous.
sorry, BIPOC, yeah, is isn't is important. It's like an explicit sort of foundation of progressive concern, and I think for good reason. And it's overwhelmingly, it's like 64%, I think, about like on average. I don't know if there's a strong gender divergence, but my understanding is it's like 64%, nearly 65%, which is more than any other demographic.
Right.
And that's
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 interesting.
like So I mean that's just anecdotally, it's like I mean there's reasons for that. My understanding is that there's an awareness that Gorsuch has kind of made his career on like tribal rights, and
Hmm.
so there's um, so it's more about like Trump associated figures than it is about Trump. That's my understanding, but also growing up in Nebraska, interacting with like Rosebud and Pine Ridge reservations to some degree, like in general, Native Americans are very pro-gun, um,
Hmm.
for a lot of reasons, but primarily because they're getting screwed over because they don't have adequate like law enforcement, and they're getting having to deal with predatory people coming into their communities and committing crimes and needing to defend themselves, right? And so these are like very conservative values, gun rights, and this, treasured group on the progressive platform is like, we want Trump, like, no question about it, because he cares about our values. And so that's just like one example of people where it's like either your options are there, those people are like if you're gonna say that they're voting against their interests, you either have to like presume to know their interests better than them, or just say that they're ignorant and they don't know what they're doing, which like
No.
both are colonial and like
Hmm.
absurd, right? So that's just like one of many examples where it's like I think you have to take seriously that like people know their own interests, you know. They might not be able
Hmm.
to articulate it in like prepositional ways, but like that.
No
Um,
worries.
yeah, so and not to spend too much time on it, but just so I think that's a really interesting data point.
Hmm.
Another thing is I kind of maybe I misunderstood, but I took a little issue with what you said about like it seemed that you were saying that there was like a cunningness on the Republican side or the MAGA side to kind of present these niche cultural issues as like either or, um, perhaps like somebody
Hmm.
like a Bannon or something.
Hmm.
But I did a little research, and it looks like this election, both sides voted something like in exit polling like 70 some percent for their respective candidate and not against the other candidate. So I think that is important to keep in mind.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so it
Right. So
seems
they're
like there
voting
was, and
because they
that's my
like
experience
who.
of interacting
Yeah.
with like, kind of right-wing media too. It's like people are excited about the possibility of like what their version, like they really do sincerely think about making America great again,
Hmm.
like whatever that
Yeah. Yeah.
means to them. It's this, so that's a positive vision that they're selecting and not like a screw Kamala, screw trans rights or whatever. And I think that that is not something that is
Oh yeah.
adequately,
No, I
so
don't.
maybe I just
Yeah.
misunderstood, but
Yeah. I wasn't so much saying that people voting for Trump don't really approve of what he wants
yeah.
to do and aren't they're not just
Okay.
voting against. I mean, I think resentment um, is part of what's going on in
Yeah, that
terms
was
of
certainly the case in the 16 election. But I
yeah,
think it's a
yeah.
little more
But people are
plausible.
excited about Trump. Obviously, I
Yeah.
see that. But I think part of what excites them too is his own uh, resentment for the establishment, and he becomes a
Hmm.
mouthpiece for their resentment. So it's
Yeah.
not just that they're holding their nose and voting for him because they hate the Democrats so much. It's they
Yeah.
like the way that he tears
Yeah.
down that establishment.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, my point was more that I think these somewhat niche cultural issues. It's not that they're totally a distraction. It's that it's just not best worked out politically. Like
Yeah. And a winner take
talk to your
all
therapist and your
two
doctor about
party.
this. Don't talk to like
Yeah.
Congress. Like I don't think that you can legislate a solution to these issues,
Hmm.
and that they should be politicized. But that the Republican parties did politicize it. I think they baited. It seems like they baited the progressive
Interesting.
Democrats into taking an extreme position that the majority of Americans don't share, you know?
Yeah. And you does that, what time are we thinking of, like since 2016 kind of?
Basically, yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, I could see that. That's you know, yeah, that's funny.
And you mentioned Bannon, and I think I think he was explicit about that kind of strategy, actually, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah,
He's a great, I mean, I wanted to touch on him at some point because I felt like and that was something that was another kind of watershed moment for me when I really, I shared with you in that little disagreement we had on was that reminded me of an experience I had in a seminar reading Antigone and like encountering all of these criticisms of of Antigone that weren't based on reading the text, but they were just like, I don't like the idea of a king, King, it's not like kings are inherently oppressive or stupid or patriarchal or whatever it may be. And it's like there's no engagement with like this could be an allegorical, you know, story
yeah.
or like and I felt that way. I don't know what kind of got over me, but I'm just, I'm by nature I'm kind of a philosopher, so I like to engage with sources directly. Um, and I think one of my guiding lights is I like to think of myself as like a cartographer of thought as opposed to a lawyer. And it's kind of incumbent on philosophers. If you do love wisdom, it's like you have to engage with reality and the social reality of what people are saying and doing. And it's kind of incumbent on you to like sort of map out how these things relate. It's not your job to sort of arbitrate like is this right or is this wrong? Like it is what it is, and it's your
Hmm.
job to sort of understand how these forces relate to each other. And if that's the case, like I over time I was like, what does Bannon actually say? Like if he's this guy who's kind of the brains behind Trump, like what does he actually say? And I remember doing some cursory searches and just being kind of stumped at how difficult it actually is to find him writing something or saying something directly that isn't just like summarized. It's not even quoted. They just sort of summarize him in the Atlantic or something. It's like there's not even any quotes here. Like, what did the man say? And
Hmm.
the only thing I could find was like an Oxford Union speech that he gave in like 2016 or something. And I was listening to it, and it was like very cogent and very interesting. And it is nationalistic, but he's explicitly not an ethno-nationalist. He's an economic popularist. And like you might disagree or you might say he's being duplicitous, but like it's kind of on you to demonstrate why that's the case if you do think that. Because he is saying America is not an ethno state. Like it's not that's not what's happening. We are economic popularists. We want to like reshore our focus to here and sort of deconstruct this like transnational global order that undercuts our sovereignty. That's what he's saying. And you might say he's being duplicitous, like I said, but like you have to, that's like kind of on you to demonstrate why that's the case. Because, and anyways, when you interact with these sources, you're like, okay, this is not what I'm hearing.
Hmm.
That's not what I'm
Right.
hearing in the Atlantic or in whatever, the Guardian. Like, I'm hearing this guy is a rabid racist nationalist. And that
Right.
is just simply not, it's not intellectually honest. And like, of course, like, um, that is the perennial specter of any traditionalist political movement. It's always the case, and people are, I think, pretty aware of it. Um, if you're going to emphasize the integrity of a polity over permeability, you're going to risk overcorrecting and, being too harsh on the margins or
Mhm.
being too, harsh um, with the demos. But like that, and that's a perennial problem. And I think a lot of conservatives or traditionalists are aware of that and are trying their best to mitigate it. And I don't see a lot of people on the left or liberals, classical liberals, like really giving them their due.
Yeah.
Um, I think they're
Yeah.
very aware that is the nationalist sort of racist specter is real, and we have to
Mm.
fight against it. But it's like it is not anywhere near the mainstream vision, or like it's just, yeah.
Yeah. It's funny you
So
said that the nationalist racist end of the spectrum is real, and I thought you said Israel for a second, and I was like,
oh,
oh yeah, that is kind of true in terms of the way that,
that's for a
Israel
whole
gets a
different
pass.
podcast.
Yeah, Israel gets a pass as, oh, you could be an ethno state. I know they have Arab Israelis and
Yeah, I mean that's
whatnot, but
just to tag on to that. Like patriotism is, I remember growing up and still to this day, like I get a little uncomfortable when I see the flag, and I think of like invading Iraq when I see the flag. I'm like, God, I want to be associated with that. And I know all of these people in the Bay Area and New York and other places, and they cannot stomach patriotism. They think patriotism is retrograde, racist, disgusting, stupid. Like, if you're patriotic, you
Mhm.
are an idiot or worse. And like, those are the same people that are stoked when they see a Ukrainian flag or an Israeli flag or whatever it is. They're like, if it's projected patriotism, that's
Mhm.
great. We want other people to be patriotic, but like somehow we don't. So it's just, seeing things from a psychological lens. I just see all of these ways where things are just overtly projected and um
Yeah,
essentialized on the other. And it's like there's no interest in self-reflection, and like it's just, yeah. Anyways, you get it.
yeah. Well, I mean, titling this "The Spiritual Mission of America" is, I borrow that title from a talk I gave on the Stoa. I don't know if you know that YouTube channel
Oh,
community,
yeah, I should look into that. Cool.
because I think I want to. In that talk, I was trying to rediscover a way of being patriotic that would be
Yeah.
inclusive enough that people across the political spectrum could be like, okay, yeah, I could see that. Um, and as we spoke offline yesterday, like the history of this country is both stained with some moral travesties, but also some great
Absolutely.
moral triumphs.
Yeah.
Um, it's like, yes, slavery played an important role in this country becoming
Hmm.
economically powerful.
Totally. And
Um,
genocide and
and
you
the
know
genocide of the
yeah.
indigenous populations here
Yeah.
was government policy, you know,
Yeah.
and so there is so much to atone for. But I think if we stop pretending like the ideals that this country was founded um, to realize was a done deal as soon as that document was signed, and instead recognize that no, this is a project that
Hmm.
may still take centuries to realize ideals, which I think, if I were to try to lay out like the two fundamental values of sort of the psycho-spiritual basis of American democracy and
Hmm.
their intention with each other, but one would be individual freedom
Hmm. Hmm.
and the other would be social justice.
Social
And
justice. Okay. Yeah.
yeah, freedom and justice for all, you know. And that there's an
Nice.
individual collective um, tension there that needs to be held. And I think the only way to do that is with great spiritual maturity. And, there's a way in which both whatever the Democratic Party and the Republican parties kind of represent is different forms of, each has its own form of individuality that it wants to protect.
Hmm.
And each has its own form of collective sort of
Justice.
justice that it wants to protect.
Hmm.
And so we're actually all on the same page. It's just that the
Nice.
individualism, um, the way that Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives understand individualism is very different. For one, it means gun rights, whereas for the other, it means, I can change my gender if I feel like it, or,
Yes.
not to belittle that, but that's what's being said,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think both are legitimate forms of freedom in certain contexts, right?
Hmm. Being said and practiced, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And in terms of justice, it's like on the right or the conservative side. Just let's not speak in French Revolutionary terms if we're doing American politics, as you said yesterday. But I
Yeah.
think on the right, when we think about justice, there's and the collective values, right? It's like, well, maybe there is some sense in which this is a Christian nation, and like those the values that underlie that the idea that each human being is created in the image of God, that there's something
Hmm.
important in that to support
Yeah.
a classical liberal government, that we value the locus of value is the individual soul.
Yes.
Where does that value come from? It has a religious basis ultimately, and
Yeah.
um,
Clearly. We swear in a Bible and our court
yeah,
system and all of our
and
jurisprudences. Yeah.
so there's some truth to this idea that okay, there are Christian values that are deeply woven into the political order established by the Constitution. Um, and the left would say social justice means about making sure that um, the people on the margins don't get left behind. And that means both
Yeah.
people in the poor and working classes, and it means people who are the ancestors of slaves and the
Yeah.
ancestors of Native Americans and so on. And I think there's truth in all of these forms of how we uphold the values of individual freedom and social justice, right? And it only occurred to me, in thinking about this conversation with you, that it's not as simple as just saying, oh, conservatives are for freedom and progressives are for social justice. Like there's a form of justice and freedom on each side of that political spectrum.
Nice. I like
Um,
that. Yeah. Yeah.
but I mean, do you see, if you were to reflect on this question, like what are the psycho-spiritual conditions that make democracy possible? Like, is there anything you would add to that list? Like, what values would we need to all share? Because if we're talking about nationalism, like there needs to be a kind of soul of a nation, a common way of making sense,
Hmm.
which traditionally and throughout history has meant we share a language. And so when you think about immigration. There are clips of Obama running for president in 2011, 2012,
Yeah.
saying, "You
Pretty
come to this
recent.
country, you got to learn English." He was
Yeah.
saying it like with a bit of a wise ass attitude about it, like,
Hmm.
you know, and that's how quickly we forget that it's not just Republicans who
Yeah.
think that, you should integrate into this country if you want to live here. Because we need that shared sense of identity to be a pluralistic democracy.
Hmm.
We need to share some values. So I don't know, freedom, justice is like what else should be in the mix, if anything? How do you think about that question?
I love this question. I think this is exactly what we need to be contemplating. You know, I don't presume to be able to answer it. Um, but I think it is the question at hand, in our age. And
So, well, you're a Buddhist, or you've practiced
yeah,
Buddhism for
sort of
10 years, you
Buddhist,
said, like,
Christian. Yeah, yeah. I
yeah,
mean, technically in
I
census,
feel
I'm a
similar.
Buddhist. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're
Uh,
around.
but there would be a Buddhist version, right, of um, like the locus of value being in like sentient sentient beings, even if we're empty of inherent self-nature, there's still
Yeah,
a convergence of causes and conditions giving rise to a sentient being who is mm, deserving of compassion or who suffers and should be suffered with, right? And so it doesn't need to be if even if this country's DNA does contain a lot of Christianity, I think there's still ways in which the other world religions and wisdom traditions uh, can inform American democracy.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the great hopes of our country. Um, yeah, okay. So I had a few quotes that I wanted to read in regards to that. Yeah, I mean, I think okay, oh, this is relevant. So there's a mythologist, Martin Shaw, that you might know of. He has a nice distinction I find between vision and dream. And you sort of took issue with the There's something not so great about the term dream. But actually, I think it's exactly right, which is like the vision is like the conscious, aspirational sort of ethos of a polity. And the dream is much more like a received kind of prophetic, unconscious, mysterious thing that you don't assent to, but you descend into. And
Nice.
I think that's exactly what's required. We need, it's the work of the saints and poets, right? We don't know yet. We don't know what the dream. I mean, I think we do. I think we have the prophetic. I'm sort of a devotee of Moby Dick, and I think that that's precisely what Moby Dick is. It's kind of
Mhm.
our postmodern American epic poem. It's a dream of what America is, not what it should be. It's not an aspirational thing. It's thoroughly dark and twisted and like kind of unrelentingly masculine and problematic in all of these ways, but it is the dream of America. Not the American dream, but the dream of America. And I think we're sort of still kind of discovering what that is, what that means. And a big part of it, I wanted to read a passage from a commentary by Edward Edinger, who is a really profound Jungian analyst on Moby Dick. And he says, "While Melville's theme is thus a universal one, a nakia, which is Greek for a night sea journey, kind of archetypal like entrance into the unconscious and uncertainty, heroic journey. The imagery, the specific content which embodies and gives its concrete realization is typically American. Moby Dick is the first major product of the American imagination to give authentic expression to the mythological depths of the collective American psyche. The theme of alienation may also have a particular relevance for the American mind because all Americans, except for the indigenous natives, are immigrants or recent descendants of immigrants. The experience of being uprooted from a mother country and transplanted to an alien wilderness is in the psychic heritage of us all. Most
Mm.
American genealogies go back to dissidents, malcontents, outcasts, or alternatively, the rejected, the persecuted, and enslaved. Americans have always fancied that the future was theirs, but the lack of a past is a perennial source of cultural inferiority, which we compensate through technological arrogance. And I think that is just dead on. Like,
Yeah.
the American dream, or sorry, the dream of America is sort of, I don't know, it might be a nightmare, it might be a prophetic dream, time will tell, but it's like we're all on this crazy ass voyage together and we're confronting like and I think Tarnas talks about this and others like California is sort of the apex of that. Like America is kind of the apex of the West, of the sort of Western heroic you know, um, gesture. And then California is like the apex of that. And the Bay Area in many ways is the apex of that. And so we're kind of at the end. What are we confronted with? The end of the world. We're confronted with the Pacific and just like the ancient vastness of the Pacific is, I think that that is, if I had to submit something, I'd say like contemplating the significance of the Pacific, sorry, and then and how that relates to alienation and homecoming, I think is really like the work that we have, and that's the work of artists and saints. And the last thing I'd say is that I don't have it with me, but there's a great book called Heidegger and Homecoming, and I think if you want to understand like what is homecoming ontologically, I think Heidegger is the guy. He has lots of problems, but he has a great essay I'm sure you're familiar with called The Origin of the Work of Art. And it's sort of a play on words of like the work of art. What is the function of art? It's essentially to establish a a vision. So, what is the term you use? A spiritual mission. you
Mm.
know, and every culture, like I think the Kaaba in Mecca is probably the most kind of conscious example of this, of like you need some kind of organizing mystery at the heart of any culture that you circumambulate around. And America's no different. And like ours is not that you can't be Muslim and be American, of course, but like um I
Yeah.
think we're doing that unconsciously. We're kind of like circling around like what is the core of this crazy American project? And I'm with you. I mean, it's something to do with this dynamic, this dialectic of freedom and justice, but it also is like in the service of alienation and homecoming, you know? And I think a lot of people, if they're honest, the sort of, I don't want to say the archetype, but the sort of the complex of homecoming is a terrifying proposition because
Mm-hmm.
once you start contemplating homecoming, then you have a home, and then you have like then you have nationalism, and then you have patriotism, and then you have like the shadow side of that, and you have to contend with that, and that's kind of the verboten subject for a lot
Yeah.
of Americans. So, and that's what I would say.
Mm. Yeah. No, I think Melville's Moby Dick is does take preeminence in terms of, being a novel that gives you a sense for um, the dream of America. And
Yeah.
I had to check because, I'm a lover of the poetry of Walt Whitman, and the Leaves of Grass
Yeah.
first came out 4 years later. So
Yeah.
Melville scooped Whitman by a few years there, in terms of historical
It was published on
preeminence.
November 14th, my birthday too. So I
Oh, there
feel
you
a
go.
special connection to it.
Nice.
Yeah,
But Whitman also has some wonderful things to say
sure
about
does.
democracy and the pluralism both of our society, but even of the self. He's such an individualist, um,
Yeah.
but he also recognizes, he says, "I am large, I contain multitudes," um, and similarly to um, some of what you were saying, like he says in one of his poems, Democratic Vistas, he says, "Democracy is a great word whose history remains unwritten because that history has yet to be enacted." Right. And so this idea that we're working towards these ideals, um, and
Yes.
it's always an ongoing project, mission, because
Yeah.
I feel like if we can shift towards that sense of understanding the potential of the country, we can avoid simply looking at our history and saying, that's a failure or that's a triumph, because
Yes.
there seems to be that simple of a split. If you compare what a Ted Cruz would say about the history of the country versus what the New York Times 1619 project would say about the history of this country, it's like, mm, we need to find some way of being okay with a tragic history that's still a source of inspiration, because if you
Yeah.
do trace that story forward, um, and this is not a justification for uh, slavery in America, but slavery has existed in every civilization for the entire history of recorded history, and it ended. The British beat us, but there was a way in which this these um, cultures, which are rightly criticized for colonial practices for centuries, also brought this institution to an end eventually. Maybe you
Yeah,
could say it took
we
too
fought a
long, but
civil war for it. I mean, Whitman's whole artistic
yeah,
career is forged in the medical camps of the Civil War.
right.
And we fought that's that we turned that chapter, and like not that the that the previous chapter doesn't exist, but like there was a reckoning, and there is no debate. Like 14th Amendment is a thing, and
It's a thing.
you
And
know?
I think Reconstruction though was sort of stalled and ended too quickly,
Totally.
and so there's still a need for that. Some,
Yeah, I'm
I
just speaking
think,
in terms of ideals. Like that
right,
ideal was
right,
like unequivocally reaffirmed.
reaffirmed.
And
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Not that it's
for
ever
sure.
complete, but yeah.
Yeah, but I think there's a way in which we can understand the history of this country. Yes, as tragic, but there's something. Tragedy is beautiful, and there's something to be learned and a sense of work yet to be done in inheriting that history.
Yeah,
And I think this country is important. Um, in some
it
ways, I
is.
feel like, as you were saying, as Melville was saying, and as Edinger talking about Moby Dick was saying, that people coming to this country were refugees in a sense, many of them leaving
Yes,
religious persecution in Europe, and there's hope. There was hope in this continent, which may have been conceived in the way that's mythologized as empty continents. They weren't empty continents, and that's another part
not
of
at
this
all.
tragedy.
Yeah,
Um, but Europe has almost destroyed itself several times, and is on the verge of doing so again, and we're contributing to that, unfortunately. Um, I just have to say about the Ukrainian flags thing. It's like, of course, I think the Ukrainians are the victims of Putin's aggression, but also NATO's aggression, and they're the middlemen caught between these two imperial powers warring against each other. And
absolutely.
I feel so
Yeah.
bad for them, but I'm not. I, um, they're being put on the front lines of a war that's actually America's war, and
Yes.
it's so complicated. I know, but like the Biden administration recently asked Zelensky and his government to lower the draft age because it's
Mm-hmm.
21 and they want it to be 18 so that
Mm-hmm.
more young Ukrainians can go on the front lines and fight Russia. Yeah, for their own country, but they're not volunteering,
No.
they would be drafted. And is this war winnable by Ukraine? I don't think so. But does the US benefit by having more dead Ukrainians and more dead Russians? And by allowing our defense contractors to continue to enrich themselves, throwing weapons into this conflict? Yes. So, anyways, that's just a source of
So sad.
a lot of anger and yeah, pain. Um, for me that just seems so obscured by just waving the Ukrainian flag in support. It's like, yes, but it seems shallow to me. Um, but yeah, I think
Right there with you.
if we can see world history leading up to the founding of this country as a bloody mess based on um, religious war and then nationalist war, and what America represents as a truly pluralistic democracy. And I know much of Europe has become vastly more ethnically plural than it was. And that leads
Yeah.
to all sorts of difficulties now in those countries. But America was, I think, always founded under the pretense of being multi-religious and multicultural and multi-ethnic, welcoming immigrants from everywhere. And, at various points in history when Congress was like, okay, not so many of that kind of person, and we're going to put you in camps, and, things like that happened. But
Yeah.
um, the overall vision was for this to be a pluralistic democracy. And if we can't do that here, it's not going to happen anywhere else in the world.
No.
So if this project fails, if we can't get democracy to work across these differences, then I don't know that there's hope for humanity, to make it through what I think is uh, both a social, political, but also an ecological bottleneck. Because there's going to be mass migration. What we've seen so far has been huge, but it's going to pale in comparison to what's coming.
Mm-hmm.
And so either America can step up and uh, live up to its ideals, or I don't know if it happens. Like, what other what other nation right now is founded under those with those principles that would be able to address a situation where it's like we either become human in a way that allows us to share some type of values um, that are deeper than our unique differences. And it's not to erase those differences, it's just to say we share
No.
one planet. Um, and this might sound nationalistic, but I think there's something about American nationalism that wants to be global, wants to be planetary.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
Not in a way that would homogenize the rest of the planet's cultures and languages and traditions, but in a way this has already happened, and it happened in maybe not the most ideal way, and the way that Hollywood sort of mass produced a sense of global culture that not only shaped how Americans think of themselves, but shaped for many
Mm, mm,
several generations how the rest of the world thinks about America. Everyone's watching American movies. Um, and I think there are some shallower values that were spread, like consumer capitalism, but there are also more important values like individual freedom and social justice that were spread by that, um, yeah, massive propaganda operation. But I think there's propaganda always has a kernel of truth. That's why
mhm,
it works. Um, so yeah, I don't know. There's something in there about the promise of this country and why I think it's important, not just for us, but for the rest of the planet, that we figure out how to get this right.
mm. That's beautiful. I don't typically think about that. I tend to be a little repulsed by like American exceptionalism because I associate it with, neocon foreign policy and stuff. But that
I
is
get that.
something that is something to consider, and it is interesting. We're such a young nation, or I don't even know if we're a nation. Like we're just talking about the dream of America and how we're sort of unconsciously stumbling towards whether that's even possible or not. But like
Yeah. Nation typically means you share an ethnicity or language or religion. Like there's it mean
language,
like
yeah.
native, native born. It means that there's
Yeah,
something there that ties you together. And America is kind of different. So is it a nation is a
totally.
good question. Yeah.
I often, I sit at Alamo Square Park near my house and sometimes I'll just people watch and I look, I'm like, what is happening here? Like, what is this shared transpersonal story that we're all participating in? And if I'm honest, it pretty much seems like a kind of a shared economic union. Like, we don't share languages, we don't share religions, we don't share like so many fundamental things about like ultimate concern and how you make sense of the world. And like it's kind of we share the same currency, kind of obey the same laws. That's about it. And I don't think that that's I mean, maybe this is like my conservative or traditionalist like political taste kind of coming through, but like I don't think that's sufficient ultimately. I think we need something like you said, like a shared language, a shared religion or a shared ethnos, which is could be, like in a Dugan sense, could be like multi multi-ethnic,
Mm.
but I don't think that's realistic in America. I think it has to be shared religion
Yeah.
and or language.
Yeah. I mean, there are some mestizo activist scholars that call for what I think they call the cosmic race, and their ideal is like all the different, white, black, Latino, Native American, like we all need to make babies together, and eventually
Mm,
we'll all be the same, you know.
yeah, I think that makes a
And
lot of sense. Yeah, there's
Mhm.
something to that. Or maybe
Yeah,
they're picking up on like how that's will happen to a large degree.
yeah,
You said something, Matt, earlier that I wanted to I really feel like we really have a kindred sense of things on this point, which is like tragedy can be beautiful. And what I would say is like, I mean, Vervaeke makes a great point about the Guernica painting. It's like, it's horrible, it's horrific, and it's beautiful. Beauty and horror are like non-exclusive. They're different, they're orthogonal, they're different things. Tragedy and comedy are intertwined, and beauty is like we can recover a deeper resolution, a deeper aesthetic resolution of tragedy in intertwined with comedy and more tragedy, you know, and that can only happen through a hermeneutics of beauty, which is a fancy way of talking about like um well, I mean, what is beauty? Beauty, I like the kind of definition I get from Heidegger, which is like it is the implicit disclosure of the transcendent through the finitude of the particular, which is like the shining, it's like the shininess on the edges of things that suggests that it is more than what it is, you know?
Mhm.
And like if that's your kind of hermeneutic, if that's what you're looking for in life, sort of maximizing for that, I think you can't go wrong. And I think that that's like, I don't know. I honestly don't know what that looks like on a cultural level, but like I pray that that's possible. And I think you see flickers of that in times and places where there's a sort of shared participation in a hermeneutics of beauty. There's a shared participation in like we see this thing and it's glorious, it's beautiful, and it's a mix of tragedy and comedy, you know. And like you see that in beautiful moments in art, like shared sporting events. I think we all see that. Like, um, you know, there's moments in American history where we're like, damn, like something shone through there that we don't quite understand, but like that's awesome. Like in a jazz solo or in a crazy home run or, Whitney Houston's national anthem or whatever it is. Like we do these like epic American things and we're just like, wow, we don't quite understand what is fascinating about it, but it is glorious. And I think that if we can lean into that and sort of like like apply our like competition or critic, like to like how do we do better at that? Like, you know, um,
Hmm.
that's what I
Yeah,
pray for. And I don't know if that's really abstract or not, but I'm pretty sure you get what I mean.
I do. I'd love to riff on that, like the aesthetics of democracy
Yeah.
um, versus, say, the aesthetics of fascism, and it's all about the
Yeah.
relative emphasis placed on the whole and the part
Mm,
um,
love that.
in a
Yeah.
composition. Uh, and like you mentioned Heidegger, who's has some problems and is also brilliant. There's
Yeah.
another um, German thinker of that time period, political philosopher Carl Schmitt,
Oh, he
who
definitely has some problems.
yeah, no, he was active in the
He was the head
justify as a
juror of the
legal, yeah,
Nazi.
for a few years, and then they
Yeah.
they gave him the boot because they thought he was just a turncoat because he was Catholic and actually against the Nazis and thought they were an unconstitutional party before they took over. And then he's like, "Oh, actually, I'll be part of your thing. Let's do this."
Yeah. Yeah.
But anyways, he defines politics as this friend enemy distinction,
Yes.
um, and I think that's quite insightful and speaks to. And this is just a tangent. I'll go back to beauty in a second. It speaks to the importance of like this conversation and the importance of maintaining um, avenues for uh, compromise through conversation and integration of interests through dialogue in order to maintain a functioning social fabric in a democratic way. And if this country and Congress can't find a way to remain friends, which is odd. Sometimes I feel like Congress is performing like they're enemies, and then after they go to the same bars and drink together.
Hmm.
Um,
Trade the
yeah, and
same
even
stocks.
yeah, and just the way that before Trump won, Biden says he's an enemy of democracy, and this is a real like existential threat. And then after he wins the election, he's goofing off with him in the Oval Office.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so we need to like politics is personal, and I think if we can not just allow these ideological differences to make us enemies with each other, but find ways in which we share interests and just not focus always on
Yes.
where we don't. But anyways, back to the aesthetics of fascism versus democracy. I think for Schmidt, like friendship becomes a way of unifying into a sense of a bounded whole. And wholeness is beautiful, but there's an intensification of beauty when the parts of a composition are not collapsed or fused into the whole, but maintain their independence in some way and are held in
Yes.
tension. And so beauty is intensified when ever greater differences are still held in harmony with each
Yes.
other. And I think the aesthetics of democracy is all about like riding that edge
Hmm.
of dissonance, dissonance and harmonization. It's jazz. It's like
Yeah,
jazz. And
absolutely. It's jazz. Yeah.
and
Wasn't that what sorry to interject, but
no, please.
who was that famous British historian?
Uh,
Wasn't Gilbert. It
uh,
was like it's
in
on the
what?
tip of my tongue. Anyways,
Um, yeah, I'm not sure.
he's like known for these massive tomes. He said that like the things that America will be remembered for in
Of jazz.
2000, yeah, baseball and jazz, because they're both these forms of like improv. Like the individual is upheld
Mm,
and sort of given the limelight to riff and like do their version of like the maximum uh amount of like harmonizing dissonance in their own unique way, but we collectively witness it and celebrate it, and that's like what America is. And so yeah, just
right.
yeah.
And it's a risky form of beauty. But it's like really seeking the most intense forms of it. Whereas I feel like fascism is reactionary because it's reactionary form of conservatism because it's like
Yeah,
seeking
fascism's
safety.
so
It's
dumb. Yeah.
but
It's
it's
like moronic. It literally is. I don't, yeah. It's
yeah.
like really dumb.
Mhm.
For that reason that you're saying, it's like it just reduces everything to this like blockhead kind of. It's very dumb.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, Edward, I've really enjoyed this conversation. We got a few minutes left here. Is there anything um, that we haven't touched on at all that you think we should speak to, or are you feeling
Hmm.
content right now?
I think we kind of arrived at a really beautiful place, no pun intended, but yeah, I
Yeah.
really appreciate that framing. I mean, it's so both in the idea of like a spiritual mission or the dream. Like I think it's both, like the conscious and unconscious of spiritual missions, vision of America, but also the dream of America. And yeah, and like what are we all involved? One of my favorite poems, is by this poet David White, you're probably familiar with, and it's a line he says, I want to know what I am and what I'm involved with by loving this world as I do. And I really, that's like maybe a closing prayer is like, yeah, I want to know what it means to be American and what we're involved with by loving this world as we do.
Thank you, Edward. I feel more prepared for the next 4 years than I was before this conversation. So thanks.
Likewise. Yeah, thank you.